On November 30th, 1943, in the basement of the Soviet embassy in Tehran, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov hesitated while completing an operational report. His pen hovered over sentences that would never appear in any official record. He was acutely aware that the upcoming Soviet offensives depended entirely on material assistance from the United States. The Red Army's advance was not solely a product of Soviet industry or manpower. It relied heavily on American trucks, jeeps, and fuel. Outside the embassy, the faint hum of Studebaker engines drifted through the streets, carrying supplies earmarked for the high-level conference where Stalin would meet Roosevelt and Churchill. In that quiet moment, Zhukov confronted a reality that would remain classified for decades. The Soviet military machine pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin was operating on Western resources. The Soviet forces, in effect, were running on American logistics. Stalin himself would later acknowledge privately that without this aid, the Soviet Union's victory would have been far from certain. By war's end, over 427,000 trucks and jeeps supplied through the Arctic convoys, the Persian corridor, and Pacific shipments would be in Soviet hands, surpassing the total number of trucks produced by the USSR during the entire war, and outnumbering the fleets of most other nations. This infusion of vehicles fundamentally changed the Red Army's operational capabilities. Units that once relied on marching and horse-drawn artillery were transformed into a mechanized force capable of sustaining extended operations across vast distances. Yet in 1943, Soviet officers could hardly have anticipated that every candid remark about this aid was being meticulously documented, not only by American observers, but also by NKVD agents, creating a secret archive that would later contradict decades of propagandistic narratives about the self-sufficiency of the Soviet war effort. The crisis in Soviet transport had roots in catastrophe. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, nearly 4 million German and Axis soldiers swept across the Soviet frontier. They encountered an army ill-prepared for modern mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet at the time, numbering roughly 700,000 vehicles, was largely obsolete. It consisted mostly of the Gaz AA, a licensed version of the 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5, derived from American designs of the 1920s. Within half a year, roughly 40% of this fleet had been destroyed or captured by advancing German forces. The statistics painted a stark picture of industrial insufficiency. Soviet factories struggled to replace lost vehicles. In 1941, production totaled just 124,176 trucks, while nearly 300,000 were lost to the Wehrmacht. As German forces approached, the gas plant in Gorky was relocated eastward, drastically reducing output. Moscow's Zist facility was repurposed for tank production, while the German army stood at the city's outskirts. By early 1942, large segments of Soviet infantry were reduced to traveling on foot, and artillery units were dependent on horse teams whenever such animals were available. The Second Shock Army, caught in the Volkhov Pocket, lost 95% of its transport in attempts to break out, forcing soldiers to carry shells by hand to weapons that had become immobile. It was into this context of logistical vulnerability that American aid arrived, gradually reshaping the Red Army into a mechanized force capable of sustaining large-scale operations. Yet, for decades, Soviet official histories downplayed or ignored this transformation. The Wehrmacht had already demonstrated the decisive role of mobility and reliable supply in modern warfare, lessons that American vehicles and fuel would allow the Soviets to learn firsthand and at scale.
Despite often having larger numbers and greater quantities of equipment, Soviet forces repeatedly found themselves outmaneuvered and surrounded during the early stages of the German invasion, largely because they could not match the operational mobility of the Wehrmacht. Many infantry formations that were intended to be motorized were forced to march on foot, covering vast distances and harsh conditions. Artillery units, dependent on prime movers, instead relied on horse teams, thousands of which perished during the brutal Russian winter, severely hampering Soviet operational flexibility. On October 1, 1941, at the port of Arkhangelsk on the Soviet Arctic coast, the first British convoy of the war, PQ-1, completed its unloading. Among the supplies were 20 American-manufactured trucks, marking the initial arrival of a vehicle flow that would intensify dramatically in the following months. For Soviet drivers accustomed to mechanically unreliable trucks that demanded hours of maintenance per operational hour, these Chevrolets, featuring enclosed cabs and dependable engines, represented an unprecedented technological advance. By November 1941, as German forces approached Moscow, American trucks were arriving in the Soviet Union at an accelerating pace, reaching approximately 2,000 vehicles per month via multiple routes. The Persian Corridor, under the supervision of American engineers who had assumed control of Iran's rail network, increased its freight capacity by 600%, facilitating a significant flow of vehicles and other vital supplies. Meanwhile, the Pacific route, although constrained to civilian and non-combat cargo due to the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, still contributed thousands of vehicles to the effort. Arctic convoys, despite facing heavy losses from German U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks, continued to deliver critical shipments throughout the treacherous northern sea lanes. The vehicles themselves were far more advanced than what the Soviets were accustomed to. The Studebaker US-6 trucks, for instance, offered six-wheel drive with power delivered to all wheels, whereas Soviet trucks typically had only four wheels with power to two. The US-6's engine produced 94 horsepower compared to the ZIS-5's 73, and crucially, the trucks were equipped with self-recovery winches, enabling them to extricate themselves from mud and snow, where Soviet vehicles often remained immobilized until the thaw. Each truck came with an extensive suite of tools and maintenance equipment, complete 128-piece toolkits, hydraulic jacks, tire repair gear, and spare parts catalogs with clearly numbered components, a level of preparedness previously unseen in the Red Army. Soviet trucks, by contrast, came with minimal or no tools at all. Additional innovations such as cold-weather starting systems, functioning cabin heaters, and sealed electrical systems resistant to moisture further enhanced reliability in harsh environments. The significance of this technological and logistical support was formally acknowledged during the Tehran Conference, held from November 28 to December 1, 1943. A particularly notable, though classified moment, occurred on the evening of November 30th during a private dinner attended only by Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and their closest aides. According to Roosevelt's interpreter, Charles Bolin, Stalin openly credited American industrial and material support as decisive to the Soviet war effort. He reportedly stated that the United States' ability to produce 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes monthly far outstripped the Soviet maximum of roughly 3,000 per month, emphasizing that American machinery was indispensable to the Allied victory. During subsequent technical discussions, Stalin singled out trucks as especially critical. He identified the Studebaker US-6 as the most effective vehicle for Soviet operational needs, describing it as foundational to the Red Army's mobility. Yet, paradoxically, only 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin would publicly minimize the impact of Lend-Lease aid, claiming it constituted a mere supplement and accounted for only about 10% of Soviet wartime production. This statement became the official Soviet narrative, propagated through censorship and reinforced by historians who were aware of the truth but prioritized personal safety and career preservation over historical accuracy.
Records from the Tehran Conference uncovered significant revelations regarding the role of American logistics in the Eastern Front. In a candid moment, Marshal Klim Voroshilov reportedly told U.S. supply officers that American trucks were indispensable to the Soviet war effort, claiming that a single U.S. vehicle was equivalent to 10 light tanks in effectiveness. This acknowledgement was striking, given that Soviet military leaders publicly attributed their success almost entirely to domestic industrial output. To comprehend the critical impact of American trucks, one must first examine the scale and complexity of Soviet supply requirements. A standard rifle division on the offensive needed approximately 450 tons of material each day, including ammunition, rations, fuel, and medical support. Defensive operations reduced this requirement to roughly 300 tons daily. Tank units were even more demanding, consuming around 1,000 tons per day. Ensuring that these enormous quantities reached frontline positions across the Soviet Union's largely undeveloped road network relied heavily on motor transport. Major General Andrei Krylev, who headed the Red Army's logistical apparatus, compiled a classified assessment in 1943 detailing these requirements. His findings, declassified only in 1991, highlighted a striking imbalance between the Soviet Union's needs and its production capacity. For offensive operations, the Red Army required a fleet of at least 450,000 trucks. However, Soviet factories produced only 49,000 vehicles between January and September 1943, while American Lend-Lease deliveries added 94,000 trucks during the same period. Without these imports, Soviet forces would have been unable to advance more than 50 kilometers from railway supply points. Beyond sheer numbers, the technical performance of American vehicles was a decisive factor. Soviet trucks, mainly ZIS-5 and GAZ-AA models, were rated for 2.5 to 3 tons, but frequently carried only 1.5 tons on frontline routes due to frequent breakdowns. By contrast, the American Studebaker US-6 could reliably transport 5 tons on solid roads and 3 tons across rugged terrain, boasting a mean distance between mechanical failures of 10,000 kilometers, 5 times that of its Soviet counterparts. The superiority of American trucks extended to design innovations. Features such as fully functional air brakes, lightweight aluminum pistons, efficient oil filtration, and thermostats that maintained optimal engine temperatures were unheard of in Soviet designs. Soviet trucks suffered from rudimentary cast iron pistons, brakes that failed in wet conditions, ineffective settling tanks, and engines prone to freezing in winter and overheating in summer. While public attention often focused on the perilous Arctic convoys, the Persian Corridor quietly emerged as the principal artery for supplying Soviet forces with American trucks. Spanning roughly 4,000 miles from U.S. ports through Iran to the Soviet frontier, this supply route represented one of the most remarkable logistical undertakings of the Second World War. American engineers rapidly transformed Iran's limited infrastructure. A single-track railway initially moving 200 tons daily was upgraded to handle 6,000 tons. Roads were constructed where only camel trails had existed, and desert assembly plants capable of processing 300 trucks per day were established. The Andamek Truck Assembly Facility became a symbol of American industrial prowess abroad.
Soviet drivers, after enduring long journeys from the Caucasus, would receive a brief 3-day orientation on American vehicles before driving them nearly 1,800 miles back to their units. The contrast between their previous experience with unreliable trucks and the dependability of U.S.-built vehicles was stark. By the middle of 1943, the Persian Corridor was transporting thousands of trucks monthly, while the port of Khorramshahr, previously capable of handling only 50,000 tons annually, managed a throughput of 250,000 tons each month. The steady flow of material fundamentally enabled the Red Army to sustain large-scale operations far from railheads and ultimately contributed to Soviet operational success on the Eastern Front. American logistical efficiency left Soviet observers in disbelief during World War II. Liaison officers reporting to Moscow were astonished at how rapidly American ports could unload ships, completing in just 2 days what took Soviet ports roughly 2 weeks. Over the course of the war, the flow of vehicles through this supply line reached into the tens of thousands, with some estimates suggesting that nearly half of all trucks delivered to the Soviet Union originated via the Iranian corridor. The operational effectiveness of this route was so striking that Soviet logistics personnel studied it meticulously and attempted to replicate the procedures. However, they were hampered by the lack of industrial capacity and organizational infrastructure comparable to that of the United States. The combination of American-manufactured trucks with Soviet rocket artillery proved transformative, creating one of the most feared weapon systems of the conflict. Initially, the BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had been mounted on ZIS-6 trucks, but production of this vehicle ceased by late 1941. Alternative configurations, including a few rail-mounted or towed units, proved almost useless for mobile operations. The introduction of the Studebaker US-6 truck fundamentally changed the battlefield. Its reinforced frame could endure the intense recoil produced by a full salvo of rockets, and its six-wheel drive capability allowed units to fire and quickly relocate before German forces could respond. The Studebaker's off-road performance exceeded that of any Soviet-built vehicle, and in 1943 it became the standardized mounting platform for the BM-13, designated BM-13N, N for normalized. By the end of the war, more than 1,800 of these standardized Studebaker-mounted launchers had been produced. Units equipped with them achieved survival rates up to 4 times higher than formations relying on domestic trucks. The ability to execute a shoot-and-scoot maneuver, firing a salvo and repositioning within 3 minutes, depended entirely on dependable vehicles. In contrast, Soviet trucks required approximately 15 minutes to accomplish the same maneuver when they were operational at all. The psychological impact of the Katyusha was nearly as significant as its destructive power. German troops nicknamed the weapons Stalin's organs and noted, often with a mixture of fear and irony, that these devastating launchers traveled on American trucks.
The adoption of a standardized American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics. With a uniform vehicle platform, the Red Army could rely on a single manual, a unified set of spare parts, and consistent training, replacing the improvised methods that had previously characterized Soviet operations. A quantitative examination of wartime production underscores the indispensable role of American vehicles. Soviet truck output from June 22, 1941 onward totaled approximately 46,100 vehicles that year, 32,300 in 1942, 41,600 in 1943, 57,400 in 1944, and 27,600 through May 1945, amounting to roughly 205,000 units over the war. By contrast, the United States supplied 427,284 vehicles. Losses were devastating. Nearly 300,000 Soviet vehicles were destroyed in 1941 alone, with total losses exceeding 500,000 by the war's end. Without American deliveries, the Soviet fleet would have been entirely depleted by mid-1942. Every Soviet offensive following the Battle of Stalingrad relied heavily on these imported trucks. By 1945, vehicles built in the United States accounted for 1/3 of the Red Army's total fleet, but represented approximately 70% of its effective transport capacity due to superior reliability and payload capacity. The American contribution was not merely supplemental, it was a decisive factor in sustaining Soviet operational mobility and enabling the Red Army's eventual victory. The economic implications of American Lend-Lease support were as significant as the military impact. In 1943, manufacturing a single Studebaker US-6 truck in the United States cost $1,830. The Soviet Union received these vehicles at no cost through Lend-Lease agreements. Attempting to produce an equivalent number of trucks domestically would have required roughly $800 million and resources that the Soviet war economy desperately needed for tank and aircraft production. Moreover, the USSR lacked the industrial infrastructure necessary to match this level of vehicular output. The transformative effect of American trucks became evident during Operation Bagration, which commenced on June 23, 1944. This offensive decisively shattered German Army Group Center and resulted in approximately 450,000 casualties. The operation's success would have been unattainable without the mobility and logistical support provided by American vehicles.
Operational planning by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky quantified this dependency. His first Belarusian front required roughly 12,000 tons of supplies every day. Soviet rail lines could transport these supplies to depots situated 60 to 100 kilometers behind the front lines, but beyond that point, trucks were essential to maintain momentum. Rokossovsky commanded a fleet of 19,000 trucks, of which 14,000 were American-made. This mechanized support allowed Soviet forces to advance 450 kilometers in just 5 weeks, outpacing German expectations, which had assumed that Soviet units would need frequent pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to reorganize and resupply. German intelligence, unaware of the American contribution, had based their calculations solely on Soviet truck production, underestimating the Red Army's operational reach by a factor of 3. During the course of the 5-week campaign, American trucks carried 400,000 tons of ammunition and 300,000 tons of food, while evacuating 250,000 wounded soldiers. Fuel consumption reached 67,000 tons, much of it transported via other American vehicles. The scale of this logistical achievement far exceeded what Soviet industry could have sustained independently. The USSR's total truck production for all of 1944 would not have been sufficient to support even 1 week of the offensive. The contrast with earlier campaigns was stark. For example, the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 collapsed partly because Soviet forces outran their logistical support within days. By 1944, the presence of American trucks enabled the Red Army to maintain continuous offensive pressure, turning tactical gains into strategic breakthroughs.
Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the USSR's most prominent commander, left behind multiple accounts attesting to the critical role of American aid, accounts that remained largely suppressed until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The first record emerged from KGB surveillance transcripts. In 1963, during a private conversation, unaware of microphones, Zhukov noted, "People claim that the Allies offered no assistance, but the truth is that American supplies were indispensable. Without these trucks, we could not have organized our reserves or continued the fight. Our artillery would have been immobile without them." Additional testimony surfaced in interviews with the Soviet writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966. These recordings, hidden until 1990, preserved Zhukov's clear acknowledgement. The Studebaker trucks were crucial in hauling artillery and sustaining the Red Army's operational tempo. In essence, the mobility provided by American vehicles became a force multiplier, enabling Soviet units to execute offensives on a scale that would have been impossible relying solely on domestic resources. In Zhukov's previously unpublished manuscript, which was confiscated by Soviet authorities in 1969 and remained inaccessible in archives until 1992, a third account emerged regarding the logistical backbone of the Battle of Berlin. Zhukov emphasized the decisive role played by American trucks in transporting an astonishing 2.2 million artillery shells within just a fortnight, a feat achievable solely due to the relentless movement of U.S. vehicles supplying the front. This logistical dimension, often overlooked in conventional narratives, revealed the critical dependence on the Red Army on Allied material support. Further insight comes from Nikita Khrushchev's clandestine memoirs, secretly transmitted to the West in 1970. These documents contain what may be the most candid acknowledgement of Soviet reliance on American aid. Voice authentication and cross-referencing with other sources post-Soviet collapse have confirmed the reliability of his statements. Khrushchev provided a rare glimpse into Stalin's private assessments regarding the Red Army's capacity to withstand the Wehrmacht independently. He recounted without ambiguity that Stalin recognized the impossibility of victory without American assistance. According to Khrushchev, Stalin expressed on multiple occasions that facing Nazi Germany alone would have resulted in catastrophic defeat due to the lack of mobility and logistical support. Trucks, Khrushchev emphasized, were a linchpin in this calculation, although the matter was never formally documented by Stalin. Despite Khrushchev's later public claims that the USSR achieved victory using its own resources, his private admissions illustrate a stark contrast in Soviet narratives, reflecting an institutional ambivalence toward the reality of Allied support. Soviet mechanics, tasked with maintaining the influx of American vehicles, became acutely aware of the technological gulf between domestic and imported engineering. American engines incorporated lightweight aluminum pistons, while Soviet counterparts relied on heavy cast iron components. Oil filtration systems were standard in U.S. trucks, whereas Soviet vehicles used crude settling tanks. Bearings in American trucks could endure 50,000 kilometers. In Soviet trucks, they often failed after just 5,000. Furthermore, the American approach to spare parts management, complete with detailed catalogs and numbered ordering systems, stood in stark contrast to Soviet practices which often required cannibalizing disabled vehicles or fabricating replacements by hand. American vehicles were also equipped with numerous safety features previously unknown in Soviet design: shatterproof glass, mirrors on both sides, functional backup lights, and hand-operable horns. Beyond the immediate operational advantages, exposure to these technologies fundamentally transformed Soviet industrial thinking. Post-war, the ZIS-150, the first mass-produced Soviet truck after the war, was directly influenced by American design principles, particularly those observed in Studebaker models.
American trucks introduced a structured maintenance culture that had been absent in Soviet practice. Concepts such as preventative maintenance, scheduled inspections, and standardized parts management were incorporated into Soviet industrial procedures, leaving a lasting impact on the development of transportation and manufacturing standards for decades. The severe logistical deficiencies of the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 1940 had already highlighted these vulnerabilities. Soviet forces, stationed a mere 150 kilometers from Leningrad, suffered enormous casualties: 126,875 killed and 264,985 wounded, despite facing an opponent of roughly one-tenth their size. Post-war analysis by Marshal Timoshenko underscored that inadequate truck availability prevented Soviet troops from concentrating effectively, proving that numerical superiority alone could not overcome transportation shortcomings. In sum, American trucks were not merely auxiliary equipment, they were a transformative influence on both wartime Soviet operations and post-war industrial thought. They addressed critical mobility shortages during pivotal campaigns, introduced new engineering standards, and instilled a systematic approach to vehicle maintenance and logistics that reshaped Soviet military and industrial practices for an entire generation. By the summer of 1944, American military vehicles had effectively addressed the logistical challenges that had plagued earlier campaigns in Finland. The Soviet summer offensive against Finnish positions in June of that year succeeded largely because American trucks were able to sustain supply lines across terrain that had previously rendered Soviet logistics nearly impossible. While Soviet propaganda frequently emphasized the role of railroads in sustaining their advance, this narrative significantly downplayed the contribution of American vehicles. Declassified studies from the Soviet General Staff clarify why reliance on rail alone would have been insufficient. During the German retreat, their forces deliberately destroyed approximately 65,000 kilometers of railway track, over 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 stations. Soviet railway units could reconstruct roughly 20 kilometers of track each day under combat conditions, but even repaired single-track lines could accommodate only 6 to 8 trains daily, compared to 40 to 50 trains on intact double-track systems. More importantly, rail lines terminated at fixed points, leaving the final 50 to 100 kilometers to frontline units dependent on road transport. Without trucks to bridge this last stretch, supplies could not reach combat formations.
German forces had already suffered from this limitation. Despite having highly skilled railway engineers capable of rapidly restoring lines, the absence of sufficient trucks caused resources to pile up at railheads, while frontline troops experienced shortages of ammunition and other essentials. American trucks were instrumental in overcoming these constraints. While Studebaker vehicles often drew attention, the full range of U.S. deliveries played crucial roles. The 51,500 Willys Jeeps provided unprecedented mobility for reconnaissance and command tasks. Approximately 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks enabled rapid movement and support for infantry squads, and 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles functioned as indispensable divisional workhorses. According to Marshal Ivan Konev, the Jeeps made it possible for commanders to oversee multiple divisions in a single day, significantly accelerating decision-making cycles and providing a tangible operational advantage. Efforts to minimize or erase recognition of American contributions began even before the war concluded. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order No. 7572, which mandated the removal of all photographs depicting foreign equipment from publication and insisted that Soviet industry alone be credited for the victory. Over the subsequent decades, this policy created a systematic campaign to expunge the presence of American trucks from collective memory. Photographs were altered to replace foreign vehicles with Soviet models. Films were edited or destroyed, and veterans' memoirs were censored to remove references to Lend-Lease aid.
The manipulation extended to statistical accounts. A Soviet history published in 1960 asserted that Lend-Lease deliveries accounted for only 4% of wartime production, a claim achieved by calculating American shipments against the total Soviet output, including civilian goods, and using ruble valuations that significantly underestimated the impact of U.S. equipment. Memoirs submitted by veterans mentioning American vehicles were rewritten. Brand names like Studebaker were replaced with generic terms such as truck, and specific references to U.S. machines were generalized as our vehicles. Entire passages were excised or reworded to eliminate any acknowledgement of foreign assistance. As Cold War tensions escalated, the suppression of Lend-Lease's role intensified. By 1948, Nikolai Woznensky, a member of the Politburo, issued reports that reiterated the minimal Soviet acknowledgement of American support while portraying the United States as a leading figure in the so-called anti-democratic camp. This narrative became entrenched for decades, forcing historians who knew the truth to either propagate official lies or risk professional ruin. Most chose the safer path, producing histories and educational materials that credited Soviet industry exclusively with the defeat of Nazi Germany. The distortions affected public understanding for generations. School children learned that the Soviet Union had triumphed largely on its own. Museums displayed captured German tanks but concealed American trucks, and war memorials celebrated Soviet armor without mentioning the vehicles that transported essential supplies to the front. Only under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost was open discussion of Lend-Lease contributions and American logistical support finally permitted, allowing a more accurate account of the wartime collaboration to emerge. In 1989, the Military History Journal published the proceedings of the Tehran Conference, which included previously unseen transcripts in which Joseph Stalin acknowledged critical wartime realities. The disclosure caused an immediate and intense reaction. For decades, public understanding of the conflict had rested on state-controlled narratives, but the revelations exposed fundamental distortions. For the first time, veterans felt able to recount their experiences without fear of censorship. At a Moscow reunion the following year, former Red Army vehicle drivers stood before their peers and recounted in detail the central role played by American-supplied trucks, narrating accounts that had remained hidden for nearly half a century. The release of archival material reshaped historical research.
scholars uncovered evidence of dual accounting systems, official statistics crafted for public display, and separate, internally circulated data used for operational planning. The internal figures revealed that by 1945, American trucks made up approximately 70% of the Soviet Union's transport capacity. Dr. Boris Zhukov, working with the newly accessible archives, calculated that without these vehicles, the Red Army would have been unable to conduct any major offensives beyond the Battle of Stalingrad. The march of Soviet forces to Berlin was heavily dependent on American equipment. The campaign demonstrated the enormous logistical challenges involved. By April-May 1945, the Red Army was sustaining an advance that involved roughly 2.5 million personnel and over 41,000 artillery pieces, all of which required a continuous supply chain through devastated German territory. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front alone demanded approximately 25,000 tons of daily supplies, maintained by a fleet of 22,000 trucks, of which 16,000 were American-made.
The pace of operations was astonishing. During the initial week of combat in Berlin, the artillery consumed around 2.5 million shells, each requiring repeated truck runs under enemy fire. On average, American trucks completed 4 supply trips per day, covering roughly 100 kilometers per round trip. In contrast, domestically produced Soviet trucks were far less reliable, often completing only a single run before suffering mechanical failure. Even at moments of tactical success, the Red Army remained critically dependent on American logistics. The vehicles used in the Victory Parade in Berlin were predominantly American, selected for their reliability and appearance. In effect, the Soviet capture of Hitler's capital was executed on equipment provided by the United States. The full scope of U.S. aid only became apparent after the Soviet Union's dissolution, and the numbers are staggering. The United States delivered 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,330 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, 2,328 ordnance service vehicles, vast quantities of spare parts and supporting materials, 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.44 million pairs of boots, 1,911 steam locomotives, and 11,075 railroad cars. The truck deliveries alone exceeded the total production of Germany throughout the war, enough to fully motorize 60 rifle divisions. By the conclusion of hostilities, American vehicles had carried 60% of all Soviet ammunition, transported 70% of fuel, evacuated 65% of the wounded, and hauled 58% of artillery units. The meticulous archival record confirms that the logistical backbone of the Red Army's victory was heavily reliant on U.S. materiel, fundamentally reshaping our understanding of the Eastern Front's operational reality. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, some Soviet officials expressed gratitude toward the United States and suggested commemorating American assistance with monuments. High-ranking figures, including Marshal Zhukov, proposed memorials that would recognize the contributions of the Allied arsenal of democracy to the Soviet war effort. However, the Communist Party systematically dismissed these initiatives. For nearly half a century, no official marker acknowledged the crucial role of American trucks and equipment. It was not until 2004 that a modest Lend-Lease memorial was unveiled in Murmansk, an event that itself sparked debate and controversy. This absence of recognition reflected a broader historical distortion. Generations of Soviet citizens were led to believe that their nation had defeated Nazi Germany entirely on its own. As surviving veterans grew older and passed away, their personal accounts became increasingly valuable sources of historical truth. In 2005, at a gathering in Moscow, surviving Soviet drivers who had operated American vehicles established the Studebaker Brotherhood. Their mission was to preserve evidence of Lend-Lease contributions, including photographs that had remained hidden for 6 decades, documenting American trucks adorned with Soviet insignia. The Brotherhood's final statement, signed by 200 former drivers, emphasized both gratitude and clarity. They had relied on American trucks to reach the front lines, consumed American-supplied rations, and fired American ammunition. The declaration stressed that acknowledging this aid did not diminish the Soviet sacrifice. Over 27 million Soviet citizens had died, but that honesty in recounting history was essential to truly honor that loss. These testimonies underscored that American logistical support played a decisive role in saving the Soviet homeland.
Today, the story of Lend-Lease retains renewed significance as Russia increasingly revises World War II history for contemporary political purposes. Modern Russian textbooks often downplay the scale of American assistance even more aggressively than Soviet-era materials once did. This is part of a larger effort to bolster national pride by reshaping historical narratives. Yet the empirical evidence remains incontrovertible. 427,284 vehicles, including trucks and jeeps, were delivered by the United States, more than twice the Soviet Union's own wartime truck production of 205,000 units. Archival records, including statements by Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov, confirm these facts. The story of these American vehicles demonstrates broader lessons beyond logistics. It illustrates how industrial capacity can determine the outcome of modern warfare, how ideology can distort historical memory, and how objective truth can eventually surface despite decades of suppression. The arrival of these 427,284 trucks and jeeps allowed the Red Army to evolve from a largely horse and rail-dependent force into a mechanized army capable of sustained offensive operations across vast distances. These vehicles were more than transportation. They provided the material foundation for Soviet advances on the Eastern Front. Ultimately, the presence of American trucks in Soviet service highlights a profound lesson in international collaboration. A democracy could supply its ideological adversary in the fight against a common enemy, demonstrating that cooperation, rather than isolation, can be decisive in defeating tyranny. The narrative of Lend-Lease trucks is thus both a story of industrial might and a testament to the resilience of historical truth, emerging long after attempts were made to obscure it. Soviet leaders themselves acknowledged a crucial reality of World War II. Stalin openly remarked at the Yalta Conference that without the machinery supplied by the United States, victory would have been impossible. Marshal Zhukov later noted that the Red Army's artillery units would have been immobilized without American trucks, as Soviet vehicles alone were insufficient for the logistical demands of the front. Even Khrushchev admitted that Soviet resistance against the German onslaught would have collapsed without this external support. Despite these admissions, the Soviet state maintained a long-standing false narrative. For decades, photographs were manipulated, memoirs were edited or suppressed, and official statistics were altered to hide the scale of foreign assistance. The Communist Party replaced historical accuracy with a version of events designed to strengthen political legitimacy, at the cost of acknowledging the full truth of the Red Army's achievements. Only with the reforms of Glasnost in the late 1980s did documents, archival recordings, and eyewitness accounts reveal the full extent of American aid. The evidence is unequivocal. The trucks provided by the United States were not merely helpful, they were indispensable. The vehicles, which Soviet soldiers nicknamed Zakodnik for their ability to traverse any terrain, became as vital to the Red Army's success as the T-34 tanks that dominate war memorials. Without these trucks, supply lines could not have been maintained, and entire operations could have stalled. This historical episode demonstrates broader lessons about information, power, and memory. It shows how authoritarian regimes can manipulate collective recollection, prioritizing ideological narratives over factual truth. Yet it also highlights how genuine evidence eventually emerges, even after decades of obfuscation. The logistical backbone of the Soviet war effort, the American trucks, stands as a testament to the decisive role of industrial capacity in modern warfare. In total, 427,284 trucks crossed the Atlantic and traversed the vast Soviet landscape to supply troops, transport artillery, and maintain momentum against the German army. These vehicles represent more than a sum of mechanical parts. They are symbols of the United States' industrial strength and of a form of international cooperation that transcended ideology. The Soviet generals' later acknowledgement that their victory depended on this support underscores a simple but profound truth. Strategic success in war relies as much on material resources as on courage and strategy. The Studebaker trucks, many of which remained in service for decades after the war, outlasted the propaganda that sought to erase them from history. Veterans, surviving records, and archival research collectively affirm that without these American vehicles, the Red Army's triumph in Berlin might have remained out of reach. In a historical irony, the United States supplied the machinery that strengthened the very power which would deny that contribution for nearly half a century. Yet, as with the reliable engines themselves, historical truth endures. The conclusion is clear. Soviet victory in the Second World War was inseparable from American logistical support. It was not merely the heroism of soldiers, but the integration of bravery with industrial output that determined the outcome. The wheels of democracy literally carried the Red Army to triumph, and history now rightly records that reality.